Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we drift far back into the cold north, into the old world of Norse mythology. A world imagined more than 1,000 years ago by people living beneath long winters, beneath northern lights, beneath skies that stayed dark for many hours each day. Tonight we wander through their 9 realms, their great tree, their gods and giants, their dwarves and serpents, and the long, slow story of how they believed the world began and how they believed it would one day end. We will move gently through 100 quiet facts, never rushing, never straining, simply drifting from one to the next, like snow settling over a sleeping land. To begin, we go back before there was a world at all. The Norse imagined that in the beginning there was no earth, no sea, no sky. There was only a vast empty space called Ginnungagap, a yawning void, a great silence stretching outward in every direction. No sand, no waves, no grass, no stars. Only emptiness waiting in the cold. And yet, this emptiness was not entirely featureless. To the north of the void lay a realm of ice and mist called Niflheim, a place of frost and fog and frozen rivers. And to the south lay a realm of fire called Muspelheim, a place of flame and heat and burning light, 2 opposites resting at the edges of nothing. From the icy land flowed 11 rivers, known together as the Elivagar. They poured slowly out of a spring called Vergelmir, the roaring cauldron, the source from which all waters were said to begin. As these rivers travelled far from their source, they cooled and hardened and turned to layers of ice, where the warm air of the fire realm met the rising frost of the ice realm. The ice began to melt, and from those slow, dripping waters, the first living being took shape. His name was Ymir, a giant, the very first of the frost giants, formed from melting rime in the middle of the void. As Ymir slept, more giants were born from his body. From the sweat beneath his arms came a man and a woman. From his legs came another being. In this strange, quiet way, the race of giants began. All descended from that first sleeping figure in the cold. Ymir needed nourishment, and so the myth gave him a companion. From the melting ice there also emerged a great cow named Odhumla. Rivers of milk flowed from her, and Ymir drank from them. The first giant fed by the first cow, both shaped from thawing frost, and Odhumla herself needed food. She fed by licking the salty rime from the ice. As she licked, day after day, a shape slowly emerged from the frozen blocks. On the first day, a head of hair appeared. On the second, a head. On the third, an entire man. This being was called Buri, the ancestor of the gods. Buri had a son named Bor, and Bor married a giantess named Besla. Together they had 3 sons. These 3 sons would become the first of the gods, and their names were Odin, Vili, and Ve. So the gods themselves were descended partly from giants, woven into the same family from the very beginning. The 3 brothers looked upon Ymir and the growing multitude of giants, and they chose to shape the world differently. In the old story, they slew the giant Ymir, and from his vast body they made all things. It is a strange and quiet act of creation. The world, built from the stillness of a fallen giant, from Ymir's flesh, they fashioned the earth. From his blood, they made the seas and the lakes. From his bones, they raised the mountains. From his teeth and shattered bone, they scattered the rocks and stones. The whole solid world, imagined as a single body laid to rest. From Ymir's skull, they made the dome of the sky, lifting it high above the earth and setting it at the 4 corners. And at each of those 4 corners, they placed a dwarf to hold the sky in place. Their names were Nordri, Sudri, Ostri, and Vestri, which meant simply north, south, east, and west. 4 small figures forever holding up the heavens. From Ymir's brains they made the clouds, drifting slowly across the new sky. From his hair they made the trees. Even the smallest things in the world were imagined as pieces of that first being, scattered and softened into forest and cloud and stone. To light the sky, the gods took sparks and embers that flew from the fire, realm of Muspelheim, and they set them into the heavens. These became the sun, the moon, and the stars, burning fragments of a distant fire, fixed forever above the sleeping earth. The sun and moon were imagined as being carried across the sky in chariots. A maiden named Sul drove the sun, and her brother Mani drove the moon. They did not travel slowly by choice. They were forever pursued by two wolves, one chasing the sun and one chasing the moon. And that endless pursuit was said to be why the sun and moon never stopped moving across the sky. Day and night, too, were given form. Night was a giantess called Not, dark and quiet, and she rode across the heavens on a horse whose mane dripped dew upon the earth each morning. Her son was Day, called Dag, bright and shining, who followed close behind her on his own horse. So darkness rode first, and light followed, around and around the world. The middle of the world, where humankind would live, was called Midgard. It means the middle enclosure, the guarded center. The gods were said to have raised a great protective barrier around it, formed from the eyebrows of Ymir, to keep the giants of the wildlands at bay, and humankind itself was made, in the old story, from trees. The gods were walking along a shore when they found two logs of driftwood, washed up and lifeless. From these they made the first man and the first woman. The man was called Ask, meaning ash tree, and the woman was called Embla. The gods gave them breath and spirit and warmth and the senses. And so the first people came to stand upon the earth. Now we come to the great tree that holds the whole imagined world together. Its name is Yggdrasil, an enormous ash tree, ancient beyond measure, whose branches stretch over all the realms and whose roots reach down into the deep places of the cosmos. It is the still center of everything, the axis around which all the worlds are arranged. The name Yggdrasil was thought to mean something like Odin's horse, for Ygg was one of Odin's many names, and a steed, in the old grim way of speaking, could also mean the gallows or the tree upon which one hung. So the world tree's very name remembered Odin's ordeal, his 9 nights hanging upon it, riding it as one rides a horse. The tree was evergreen, and from its leaves, the old poems say, fell a sweet dew that gathered in the valleys, and bees fed upon it, so that the great tree quietly nourished the small life of the world below. Yggdrasil was said to have 3 great roots, and each root reached into a different region. One root reached toward the realm of the gods, one reached toward the land of the frost giants, and one reached down into Niflheim, the misty world of cold and the dead. The tree connected everything, the high and the low, the living and the lost. Beneath one of these roots lay a well of great wisdom, called Mimir's Well. Its waters held knowledge and memory, and it was guarded by a being named Mimir, who drank from it each day and grew wise beyond all others. To drink from that well was to gain understanding, but the price for it was never small. Beneath another root lay the Well of Urd, sometimes called the Well of Fate. Here the gods were said to gather and hold council, and here dwelled 3 powerful women whose work shaped the lives of all beings. These were the Norns, and we will return to them in time, for they sit close to the heart of the whole imagined world. The branches of Yggdrasil held 9 realms in all, woven through its trunk and roots and crown. There was Asgard, the home of the gods. There was Midgard, the home of humankind. There was Jotunheim, the wild land of the giants. There was Vanaheim, the home of a second family of gods called the Vanir. There was Alfheim, the bright home of the light elves. And there were 4 realms more. There was Svartalfheim, sometimes called Nidavellir, the dark underground home of the dwarves. There was Niflheim, the world of ice and mist. There was Muspelheim, the world of fire. And there was Helheim, the cold, quiet land of the dead, ruled over by a being named Hel. 9 realms in all, held within the branches and roots of a single tree. Many creatures were said to live upon Yggdrasil. High in its topmost branches sat a great eagle, ancient and watchful, who knew many things. And between the eyes of that eagle perched a hawk, sitting quietly and looking out across the worlds. Down among the roots gnawed a terrible serpent or dragon called Nidhogg. It chewed endlessly at the deepest root of the tree, far below in the cold, while the eagle watched from above. Nidhogg laboured away beneath, and between them the tree endured, neither falling nor wholly at peace. Running up and down the trunk of Yggdrasil was a small squirrel named Ratatoska. Its task in the old story was to carry messages between the eagle at the top and the serpent at the bottom, and the messages it carried were insults. Spiteful words passed back and forth, so that the squirrel kept a quarrel alive along the whole length of the tree, a small, restless creature in an endless errand. 4 stags were also said to wander among the branches of Yggdrasil, feeding upon its leaves and tender shoots. Their names were Dane, Devalin, Dunea, and Durathor. They moved slowly through the high foliage, nibbling at the great tree, part of the gentle wearing away that the tree forever endured. The tree suffered much. The old poems say, the stag bit it from above, the serpent gnawed it from below, and its sides rotted with age. And yet it lived on. For each day the Norns drew water from the well of Erd and poured it over the roots, along with white clay, to keep the tree from withering. So the world tree was tended like something beloved, watered and cared for against decay, connecting the realm of the gods to the world of humankind, was a shimmering bridge called Bifrost. It appeared in the sky as a rainbow, arcing across the heavens in bands of colour. The gods rode across it, and it was said to be made partly of fire, which gave it its red band. A fire that would burn any unworthy being who tried to cross. The bridge was guarded by a god named Heimdall, the watchman of the gods. He needed less sleep than a bird. He could see for 100 leagues by day or by night, and his hearing was so keen that he could hear the wool growing on a sheep and the grass growing in the earth. He stood at the edge of the rainbow bridge, watching and listening, ever alert for the approach of danger. Heimdall carried a horn called Gjallarhorn, the resounding horn. It was said that when the final danger came at last to the gods, Heimdall would lift this horn to his lips and blow a single great blast, loud enough to wake every realm. Until that day, the horn waited, silent, held by the watchman at the bridge. Heimdall himself had a strange origin. He was said to have been born of 9 mothers, 9 sisters, who are often understood to be the 9 daughters of the sea, the waves themselves. So the watchman of the gods was born of the seas, 9 waves, and perhaps that is why his senses reached so far. Born as he was of the wide and listening water. There was also a tale in which Heimdall walked the earth among humankind under the name Frigg. He travelled from house to house and stayed 3 nights in each. And from his visits were born the founders of the different orders of human society, the labourers, the free farmers, and the lords. So the watchman at the Rainbow Bridge was imagined in this story as a quiet ancestor of humankind itself, walking the green world long ago and leaving his line behind him. Now we come to the chief of the gods himself, Odin. He was called the All-Father, the highest of the gods of Asgard. He was a god of many things at once, a god of wisdom and poetry, a god of magic and of the runes, a god of war, but also a wanderer, often travelling the worlds in disguise as an old man in a wide hat and a grey cloak, leaning on a staff. Odin was known by a great many names, more than any other god, for he wore many faces and walked many roads. He was called the All-Father, and the Wanderer, and the Raven God, and the Father of the Slain, and dozens of names besides, each catching some part of his nature. He was the one-eyed traveller, the grey-bearded stranger at the edge of the firelight, the seeker who would go anywhere and pay any price for wisdom. In his many names lay the sense that he was never quite fully known, always moving, always in disguise, glimpsed and then gone. Odin had only one eye, and there was a story behind it. To gain wisdom, he travelled to Mimir's well, the well of knowledge beneath the roots of the world tree. He asked to drink from it, and the price asked of him was his own eye. Odin gave it willingly, casting his eye into the well, and so he saw the world ever after with one eye, having traded the other for understanding. There was another tale of how Odin gained knowledge, stranger still, to learn the secret of the runes, the magical letters of power. Odin hung himself upon Yggdrasil. He pierced himself with his own spear and hung from the wind-swept tree for 9 long nights, taking neither food nor drink, gazing down into the depths. And at the end of that ordeal, the runes revealed themselves to him, and he seized them and fell back from the tree, carrying their wisdom. The runes that Odin won were more than letters. They were the angular characters of the old northern alphabet, carved into wood and stone and bone, and they were believed to carry power within their very shapes. The right runes, rightly cut and rightly spoken, could heal or bind or bless or turn aside harm. They could calm the sea or quiet a fire or ease a sorrow. The whole alphabet was imagined as a row of small powers, waiting to be unlocked by those who knew them. And it was Odin's gift, won through his long ordeal upon the tree, to know them and to share them. People carved them upon memorial stones for the dead, and upon weapons and rings and doorways, trusting the old shapes to guard and to remember. Odin's spear was called Gungnir. It was forged by skilled dwarves and was said never to miss its mark, always flying true to whatever it was aimed at. It was one of the great treasures of the gods, and a symbol of Odin himself. Upon his shoulders, Odin kept 2 ravens. Their names were Hugin and Munin, which meant thought and memory. Each morning he sent them flying out across all the worlds, and each evening they returned to whisper into his ears all that they had seen and heard. Through them, Odin knew what passed in distant places, and he was said to fear most of all that one day they might not return. At his feet lay 2 wolves, named Geri and Freki, both names meaning the ravenous or greedy one. Odin fed them from his own table, giving them all his meat, for it was said the All-Father himself needed no food and lived on wine alone. 2 wolves and 2 ravens, his quiet companions in the high hall. Odin rode a remarkable horse named Sleipnir, the finest of all horses. Sleipnir had 8 legs and could gallop over land and sea and through the air, carrying Odin swiftly between the worlds, even down into the land of the dead and back again. There was no steed in all the realms to equal him. Odin's great hall in Asgard was Valhalla, the hall of the slain. Its roof was said to be thatched with golden shields, and its rafters were spears. Here, Odin gathered the spirits of brave warriors who had fallen, and they feasted and rested in his hall, honored guests in the home of the All-Father. The warriors chosen for Valhalla were gathered from the battlefields by the Valkyries. These were fierce and beautiful female figures who rode through the air and over the sea, choosing who would be taken to Odin's hall. Their name meant choosers of the slain, and they served the warriors mead in the great hall once. The fighting was done. In Valhalla, the old story said, a goat named Heidrun stood upon the roof and fed upon the leaves of a special tree. From her udder flowed not milk but mead, enough to fill a great vessel each day, so that the hall was never without drink. And a great stag named Yggdrasil stood there too, and from his antlers dripped the waters that fed the rivers of the worlds. Odin was also the god of poetry, and there was a tale of how poetry came into the world. It was held in a magical mead, brewed from the blood of a wise being mixed with honey. This mead of poetry was hidden deep inside a mountain, guarded by a giant. Odin, in disguise and through cleverness, made his way to it, drank all of it, turned himself into an eagle, and flew back to Asgard, carrying the mead within him, and so gave the gift of poetry to gods and to worthy people. There was more to that tale of the mead, and it began with a being named Kvasir. When the Aesir and Vanir made their peace, they were said to have created Kvasir from their mingled essence, and he was the wisest being that ever lived, able to answer any question put to him. But Kvasir was slain by two dwarves, who drained his blood and mixed it with honey. And from this they brewed the mead of poetry. Whoever drank of it became a poet or a scholar. The mead passed from the dwarves to a giant named Suttung, who hid it deep within a mountain and set his daughter, Gunnlod, to guard it. It was she whom Odin charmed in his disguise, and who allowed him to drink 3 great draughts from the 3 vessels in which the mead was kept, called Odrerir, Bodden, and sun. In 3 swallows, Odin emptied them all, and then escaped in the shape of an eagle. So all the poetry in the world was once the blood of the wisest being, brewed in the dark, guarded in a mountain, and carried home in the body of a god. Odin's wife was Frigg, the highest of the goddesses, queen of Asgard. She was associated with marriage, motherhood, the household, and foresight. It was said that she knew the fates of all beings, that she could see what was to come, and yet she kept her knowledge to herself and spoke of it to no one, a quiet keeper of hidden things. Frigg had a hall of her own called Fensalir, the marsh halls. There she sat at her spinning, and some old stories say that the threads she spun and the clouds she shaped were woven into the fabric of the sky itself, the image of a goddess at her spinning wheel, turning out soft threads, sits gently among the old tales. Frigg was attended by a circle of goddesses and handmaidens, each with her own gentle office. There was Air, the finest of healers, associated with the mending of wounds and sickness. There was Fulla, who carried Frigg's small chest of treasures and knew her secrets. There was Gnar, Frigg's swift messenger, who rode through the air on a horse named Hofvarpnir, the hoof thrower, that could run over sky and sea. There was Var, who listened to oaths and the promises exchanged between people, and who held them to account. And there was Saga, a goddess associated with stories and remembrance, who was said to drink each day with Odin in a hall where cool waves flowed. These were the quiet attendants of the Queen of the Gods, each tending some small thread of the world, healing, keeping, carrying, remembering. Now we come to the most famous of all the Norse gods, Thor. He was the son of Odin, the god of thunder, the defender of both gods and humankind. He was imagined as immensely strong, with red hair and a red beard, fierce in temper, but steady in his protection of the worlds. When people heard thunder rumbling across the sky, they imagined it was Thor. Thor's most famous possession was his hammer, Mjolnir. It was forged by dwarves, and it was said never to fail. When thrown, it would always strike its target and always return to Thor's hand with it. Thor could level mountains. The hammer was a weapon, but it was also a tool of blessing, used to hallow and protect. And small hammer charms were worn by people for safety. The hammer had one curious flaw. When the dwarves forged it, its handle came out a little too short. This happened, the story says, because Loki, in the shape of a fly, bit the dwarf who was working the bellows, and the dwarf flinched. So the mightiest weapon in the worlds had a slightly stunted handle, a small imperfection in a perfect thing. To wield such a hammer, Thor needed help. He wore a belt of strength called Meggingjord. When he buckled it on, his great strength was doubled, swelling within him. Without it, even Thor was not quite Thor, and so he kept it close. He also wore a pair of iron gloves called Jarngreipr. With these, he could grip the hot, heavy hammer and swing it without harm. The hammer, the belt, and the gloves together made up the three great treasures by which Thor did his work. Thor travelled in a chariot pulled across the sky by two goats. Their names were Tangrisnir and Tanginjoster, which meant something like teeth bearer and teeth grinder. The rumble of his chariot crossing the heavens was another sound that people imagined as thunder. These goats had a marvelous quality. At night, Thor could slaughter and cook them for a meal, and then, by laying their bones and skins together and blessing them with his hammer, he could bring them back to life by morning, whole and well again, ready to pull his chariot onward. A small, endless miracle of renewal. Thor's hall in Asgard was called Bilskirnir. It was said to be the largest building ever made, with hundreds of rooms, a vast dwelling for the great defender. There he rested between his journeys into the wild lands. Among the most famous tales of Thor was his fishing trip, when he rowed far out to sea with a giant and cast a line baited with an ox head, hoping to catch the great serpent that encircled the world. He hooked it, and a tremendous struggle followed. The serpent and the god straining against each other across the dark water, but the frightened giant cut the line, and the serpent sank back into the depths paths, and the two were left to meet again another day. That world serpent was Jormungandr, also called the Midgard serpent. It was so vast that it lay in the ocean encircling the whole of Midgard, biting its own tail, a great ring of scales around the world of humankind. It was one of the strange children of the trickster god, Loki, and it was destined one day to be Thor's final foe. There was a strange and dreamlike tale of Thor journeying to the stronghold of a giant king called Utgarda Loki, in a hall so vast it could scarcely be seen to its far end. There the giant set Thor and his companions a series of contests, and the gods seemed to fail at everyone, though nothing was as it appeared. Thor's young servant raced against a runner and lost, but the runner was thought itself, which nothing can outrun. Thor was given a drinking horn and told to empty it, and though he drank and drank with all his might, the horn would not empty, for its far end, unknown to him, reached down into the sea, and his great draughts were drawing down the ocean. He was asked to lift a grey cat from the floor, and strained with all his strength, and managed only to raise one of its paws, for the cat was in truth the world serpent Jormungandr, and to lift even its paw was to lift the world, and he was set to wrestle an old woman, and was slowly forced down to one knee, for the old woman was Ellie, who was old age itself, which brings down even the strongest in the end. Only when the gods had departed did the giant reveal these things, and then his great hall vanished, for it had all been illusion. It is a tale less of battle than of the quiet. Truth that some things, the sea, the world, old age, cannot be wrestled down by strength alone. Now we come to Loki himself, one of the most complicated figures in all the old stories. Loki was counted among the gods and lived in Asgard, yet he was the son of giants. He was a shapeshifter, able to take the form of a salmon, a fly, a mare, a falcon, an old woman, whatever suited his purpose. He was clever and quick-witted, a source of both help and harm to the gods. Loki was often the cause of trouble, and just as often the one who undid it. Many of the gods' greatest treasures came into being because of mischief Loki started and then had to fix. It was Loki in one tale who arranged the contest among the dwarves that produced Thor's hammer, Odin's spear, and other wonders, all to make up for a prank he had played. Loki's children were among the strangest beings in the myths. With a giantess named Angerboda, he fathered 3. The first was the great wolf Fenrir. The second was the world serpent Jormungandr. And the third was a daughter named Hel, who would come to rule over the land of the dead. 3 fearsome children, each bound up with the fate of the worlds. Loki was also, in one strange tale, a mother. To distract a giant builder's powerful stallion, Loki turned himself into a mare. From that meeting, Loki later gave birth to a foal, and that foal was Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse that became Odin's steed. So, the finest horse of the gods was born of the trickster himself. Loki had a faithful wife among the gods named Sigyn. She remained loyal to him even through his darkest fate, and her devotion forms one of the quietest and most touching images in the whole body of myth, as we will see when we come to the end of his story. Among the goddesses, one of the greatest was Freyja. She belonged not to the Aesir, the gods of Asgard, but to the Vanir, a second family of gods associated with fertility, prosperity, and the bounty of the earth. She came to live among the Aesir as part of a truce between the two families, and she was honored as a goddess of love, beauty, and abundance. Freyja possessed a famous necklace or jeweled collar called Brisingamen. It was made by dwarves and was a thing of extraordinary beauty, and it became one of her defining treasures, a symbol of her radiance. Freyja owned a cloak made of falcon feathers. When she put it on or lent it to another, the wearer could fly through the air in the form of a falcon. The gods sometimes borrowed this cloak when they needed to travel swiftly between the worlds. Her chariot was pulled by 2 large cats. The image is a gentle one, the goddess of love riding across the sky in a cart, drawn by great cats padding through the air, and it has lingered in imagination ever since. Freyja had a hall and field of her own called Folkvang, the field of the people. There she received many of the dead, for it was said that she chose half of those who fell in battle, and Odin received the other half. So even the honored dead were divided between two halls, half to Odin's Valhalla and half to Freyja's field. Freyja's brother was Freyja, another of the Vanir, a god of sunshine, rain, fertile fields, and peace and prosperity. He was much loved, for he governed the growth of crops and the gentleness of the weather, the things on which quiet life depended. Freyja owned a marvelous ship called Skidbladnir. It was the finest of ships, large enough to hold all the gods, and it always had a favourable wind the moment its sail was raised. Yet it was also made so cleverly by the dwarves that it could be folded up like cloth and tucked into a pouch when not in use. A great ship that could rest in a pocket. Freyja also owned a golden boar named Gullinbursti. The golden bristled. It could run through the air and over the water faster than any horse, and its glowing bristles lit up the darkness around it, so that Freyja never travelled in shadow. Another of the clever works of the dwarves. There was a tender story of how Freyja fell in love from Odin's high seat, from which all worlds could be seen. Freyja once looked out and saw a beautiful giantess named Gerd, whose arms shone so brightly that they lit the air and the sea. He fell into a deep longing for her, and he gave away his own magnificent sword to win her hand. That gift would cost him dearly at the end of all things, for he would face the final battle without it. The father of Freyja and Freyja was Njord, a god of the sea, of winds, of fishing, and of wealth. He was associated with calm coastlines and safe harbours and the prosperity that came from the sea. He lived by the shore in a place called Noatun, the place of ships. There is a quiet story of Njord's marriage to the giantess, Skadi. She came to the gods seeking recompense for her slain father, and as part of the settlement, she was allowed to choose a husband, but only by looking at the god's feet. She chose the most beautiful feet, hoping they belonged to the bright god Baldr, but they belonged instead to Njord of the sea. Their marriage was a gentle disagreement of landscapes. Skadi loved the high, cold mountains, where she hunted on skis with her bow. Thor loved the seashore, where the gulls cried and the waves moved. Neither could bear the other's home for long. He could not sleep for the howling of the wolves in her mountains, and she could not sleep for the calling of the seabirds at his shore. And so, in the gentlest of partings, they agreed to live apart, each in the land they loved. Skadi herself was remembered as a goddess of winter, of skiing, of the bow and the hunt, striding across the snow in the high places. She is one of the figures who give the Norse myths their deep sense of cold and stillness, of vast white landscapes beneath a low sun. Among the goddesses was Idun, the keeper of youth. She tended a basket of golden apples, and the gods ate of these apples to keep themselves young. Without them, the gods would grow old and grey like any mortal. So all the agelessness of Asgard rested in the quiet keeping of one goddess and her store of golden fruit. Idun's husband was Bragi, the god of poetry and eloquence, wise and gentle of speech, with runes said to be carved upon his tongue. He was the finest of poets, and he welcomed the honoured dead into the high hall with words of greeting. Where Odin won poetry by cunning, Bragi simply was poetry, calm and flowing. There was a tale of how Idun and her apples were once lost. A giant named Thiazi, in the shape of a great eagle, forced Loki to lure Idun out of Asgard, and there he seized her and carried her away to his mountain home. At once the gods began to wither and grey, for without the apples they could not hold back age. Realizing the cause, they forced Loki to set it right. Borrowing Freyja's falcon cloak, Loki flew to the giant's hall, turned Idun into a nut, and carried her home through the air, with the eagle giant in furious pursuit. The gods kindled a fire upon the walls of Asgard that caught the eagle's wings, and so Thiazi fell, and the apples were saved, and youth returned to the gods. And the daughter of that fallen giant was Skadi, the winter goddess of whom we have already spoken, who came to Asgard seeking recompense, and chose Njord by the beauty of his feet. Now we return to the three women at the well of Erd. the Norns. They were the shapers of fate, and they sat beside the well at the root of the world tree, weaving and measuring the lives of all beings, gods and giants and humankind alike. Even the gods were subject to their work. Fate, in the Norse imagination, was older and deeper than the gods themselves. The three Norns were often given names that reflected the flow of time. One was Erd, whose name meant that which has become the past. One was Verdandi, whose name meant that which is becoming the present. And one was Skald, whose name meant that which shall be the future, past, present, and future, sitting together at the roots of the world. The Norns were sometimes imagined working at a loom, weaving the threads of fate, and sometimes carving runes, and sometimes drawing water and tending the world tree. In all these images, the same idea returns gently, that the course of every life was being quietly shaped at the still center of things, beside the cool waters of the well. There were said to be many lesser Norns as well, beyond the three great ones. Some came from the gods, some from the elves, some from the dwarves. It was believed that such beings attended the birth of each child and shaped the life that lay ahead, so that every person carried a fate woven especially for them. Among the most beloved of the gods was Baldr, the son of Odin and Frigg. He was the god of light, of brightness, of beauty and goodness. He was so radiant that light shone from him, and he was so fair and gentle that all the gods loved him. His hall was called Breidablik, the broad gleaming, and it was said that nothing impure could exist within it. Baldr began to be troubled by dark dreams, dreams that foretold his own death. The gods were filled with worry. To protect him, his mother Frigg travelled throughout all the worlds and obtained a promise from everything: fire and water, iron and stone, trees and beasts and sickness, that none of them would ever harm Baldr. And so he seemed to become invulnerable, safe from all the world. The gods made a game of it. They would throw things at Baldr, stones and spears and arrows, and laugh as everything refused to hurt him, glancing away or stopping short, for all things had sworn not to harm him. He stood unharmed amid the hail of objects, gleaming and safe, and the gods delighted in it. But Frigg had overlooked one small thing. She had not asked an oath of the mistletoe, thinking it too young and too small to be any danger. Loki learned of this single gap in the protection, and from the mistletoe he fashioned a small dart or sprig and carried it quietly to the gathering where the gods were. At their game, among the gods, stood Baldr's brother, Hoder, who was blind and who took no part in the game because he could not see to throw. Loki approached him and offered to guide his hand so that he too could honor Baldr. He placed the mistletoe in Hoder's hand and aimed for him. Hoder threw, and the mistletoe flew, and it struck Baldr, and the bright god fell. The one thing in all the world that had not sworn. The oath had pierced him, and he died. It is one of the saddest moments in all of Norse myth. The death of the gentlest god through a small and overlooked thing. The grief of the gods was beyond words. Baldr's body was carried to the shore and laid upon his great ship, named Hringhorni, the largest of all ships, which was to be his funeral pyre. His wife, Nanna, was so overcome with sorrow that her heart broke, and she died of grief, and she was laid upon the pyre beside him, the two of them together. The funeral ship was so heavy, laden with the body and with treasures, that the gods could not push it out to sea. They had to call upon a giantess named Hyrrokin, who came riding upon a wolf, and with a single push she sent the great ship sliding down into the water with such force that the earth trembled. So the brightest of the gods was sent burning out across the sea. There was still one hope. A god named Hermod, another son of Odin, offered to ride down into the land of the dead to plead for Baldr's return. He mounted Odin's 8-legged horse Sleipnir and rode for 9 nights through dark and deep valleys until he reached the realm of Hell, where Baldr now sat in a place of honor. Hell, the ruler of the dead, agreed to release Baldr, but only on one condition. The condition was this: if every single thing in all the world, living and dead, would weep for Baldr, then he would be allowed to return. And so the gods sent word to all the worlds, and all things wept for the beloved god. Stones and trees and metals and beasts, all shedding tears as ice weeps when it thaws. But one giantess in a cave refused to weep. She said that Baldr meant nothing to her, and that the dead should stay with the dead. And because of that one refusal, widely believed to be Loki in disguise, Baldr could not return, and remained in the land of the dead to await the end of the world. The land of the dead itself was ruled by Loki's daughter, Hel. She was a strange and solemn figure, often described as half one colour and half another, half living and half dead in appearance. Her realm, Helheim, was a cold and quiet place far below, where those who died of sickness and old age were said to go, as opposed to the warriors who went to the halls above. Hel's hall was furnished with grim and quiet names in the old poems. Her plate was called Hunger, and her knife was called Famine. Her threshold was called Stumbling Block, and her bed was called Sickbed. These names painted her realm as a place of stillness and want, neither cruel nor kind, simply the quiet end toward which the unwarlike dead drifted. The road to Hel's realm was long and downward, the same road the god Hermod rode upon Sleipnir when he went to plead for Baldr. It led through deep, dark valleys to a river called Gjoll, cold and swift, over which lay a bridge roofed with shining gold. The bridge was kept by a maiden named Modgud, who asked each traveller their name and their errand, and who remarked that Hermod, still living, made the gold bridge thunder more beneath him than all the pale companies of the dead who had crossed it before. Beyond the bridge stood the gates of Hel, high and barred. A great hound named Garm was said to guard the entrance to that realm, baying at the mouth of a cave, and it was foretold that at the end of all things, Garm would break loose and howl, one of the signs that the doom of the gods had come. So the land of the dead had its river, its golden bridge, its watching maiden, and its guardian hound, a quiet country with its own gates and keepers. Now we come to another of Loki's monstrous children, the wolf Fenrir. He grew so quickly and so terribly that the gods became afraid of him. For it was prophesied that he would one day bring great harm. At first, they kept him among themselves, and only the brave god Tyr dared to feed him. The gods decided that Fenrir must be bound. Twice they tried to chain him with great iron fetters, and twice they presented it as a test of his strength. And twice the wolf, eager to prove himself, allowed himself to be bound and then burst the chains apart with ease. No ordinary chain could hold him. So the gods sent to the dwarves, the master craftsmen, and asked them to make a binding that nothing could break. The dwarves made a ribbon called Gleipnir. It was soft and smooth as a silken band, deceptively slender, yet stronger than any chain. It was made, the story says, from 6 impossible things: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird, because the gods had gathered these things into the ribbon. None of them are found in the world any longer. When the gods brought the slender ribbon to Fenrir, he was suspicious. It looked too weak to be a true test, and he sensed a trick. He would only agree to be bound by it if one of the gods would place a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith. Only Tyr, the god of justice and courage, was willing to do so. He placed his right hand between the wolf's jaws. The ribbon held. The more Fenrir struggled, the tighter it became, until he was bound fast and could not break free. And when the wolf understood that he had been deceived and would not be released, he bit down and Tyr lost his hand. Tyr was honoured ever after as the god who sacrificed his own hand so that the wolf could be bound, the one who paid the price for the safety of the gods. Fenrir was bound to a great rock deep below, with a sword set in his jaws to hold them apart. And there he would remain until the end of all things. The gods had not destroyed the danger, only delayed it, for it was fated that Fenrir would one day break free. Tyr himself was one of the oldest of the gods, a god of war, but more deeply a god of justice, law, and oaths. The fact that he was willing to break his own pledge, knowingly, sacrificing his hand for the good of all, made him a figure of grave honour. He represented the idea that justice sometimes asks a heavy price, paid willingly. Now, let us turn to the dwarves, the master craftsmen of the Norse world. They lived underground, in the dark realm of stone and metal, and they were the finest smiths and makers in all the world. Nearly every great treasure of the gods came from their forges. Thor's hammer, Odin's spear, Freyja's ship and boar, Freyja's necklace, and the ribbon that bound the wolf. The origin of the dwarves was a strange and quiet one. In the old story, when the world was made from the body of Ymir, small creatures like maggots appeared in his flesh. The gods gave these creatures wit and the shape of men, and they became the dwarves, dwelling in the earth and the stones, born from the body of the first giant. Thor's wife was Sif, a goddess known above all for her hair, long and golden as a field of ripe grain. There is a tale that Loki, in one of his mischiefs, crept up while she slept and cut off all her hair. Thor's fury was terrible, and to make amends, Loki was sent to the dwarves to have new hair made, hair of real spun gold that would grow upon Sif's head like her own. While he was among the dwarves, Loki goaded them into a contest of craftsmanship, wagering his own head that they could not match the finest treasures. From their forges came wonder after wonder. The sons of one dwarf made Sif's golden hair, and the folding ship Skidbladnir, and the spear Gungnir. Then 2 brothers, Braka and Sindri, set to work, and Loki, fearing he would lose his wager, turned into a fly and bit the dwarf at the bellows to spoil the work. From that second forge came 3 more treasures: a golden boar, Gullinbursti, that ran through the air with shining bristles, a golden ring, Draupnir, with a marvelous quality. For every 9th night, 8 new rings of equal weight would drip from it, so that wealth flowed endlessly from a single ring. And it was this ring that Odin would one day lay upon Baldr's funeral pyre. And last came the hammer Mjolnir, whose handle, as we have heard, came out a little short because of Loki's biting, yet which was judged the greatest treasure of all, for it would defend the gods against the giants. So Braka won the wager, but Loki kept his head by a trick of words, arguing that the dwarf might take his head but not his neck. And so the dwarf settled for sowing. Loki's lips shut for a time, a fitting silence for the silver tongue. From that single contest came nearly all the great treasures of the gods. The light elves of Alfheim were imagined as beautiful and radiant beings, fairer than the sun to look upon. They lived in their own bright realm and were associated with light and with gentle, helpful natures. Though the old stories tell us less of them than of the gods and the giants, they remain shining figures at the edge of the imagined world. Not all the dwarves' gold was fortunate. There was a dwarf named Andvari who lived as a fish beneath a waterfall and hoarded a great treasure of gold. When the gods needed gold to pay a ransom, Loki caught Andvari and took all his hoard, down to a single golden ring that the dwarf tried to hold back. Loki took even that, and in his grief and rage, Andvari laid a curse upon the ring and upon all the gold, that it would bring death and ruin to whoever owned it. The cursed gold was paid over as a ransom and passed from hand to hand, and wherever it went, the curse followed, sowing greed and betrayal and sorrow among those who held it. From this cursed treasure grew one of the great tragic story cycles of the North, of heroes and dragons and doomed families. It is a quieter kind of Norse tale, not of gods in their halls, but of the long shadow. A single ring of gold can cast, passing down through the generations like a fate that cannot be set aside. The giants, called the Jotnar, were the great rivals of the gods, and yet they were not simply enemies. They were older than the gods, descended from Ymir himself, and they often represented the wild and untamed forces of the world, the frost, the mountains, the sea, the raw powers of nature. Gods sometimes married giants, learned from them, and depended on them. The giants' land, Jotunheim, lay beyond the bounds of the gods' world, across rivers and mountains, a wild country of crags and forests and cold, between the realm of the gods and the realm of the giants. The old poems say, ran a river called Iving that never froze, even in the deepest winter, forever flowing and forever dividing the two kindreds. Yet the boundary was crossed often enough by gods seeking wives or wisdom or adventure, and by giants seeking the treasures and the goddesses of Asgard. The two worlds leaned against each other across that unfreezing river, rivals and yet bound together, as they had been since the first giant gave his body to make the world. One of the most important giants was Aegir, a lord of the sea, who brewed ale for the gods and hosted great feasts in his hall beneath the waves. His hall was lit not by fire, but by gleaming gold, which shone like firelight in the depths. To sit at Aegir's table was to feast in a hall of glowing treasure at the bottom of the sea. Aegir's wife was Ran, a goddess of the sea who was imagined with a great net. With it she gathered up those who drowned at sea, drawing them down into her hall beneath the waves. The sea, in the Norse imagination, was both a provider and a taker, and Ran was the quiet figure who received the lost. Aegir and Ran had 9 daughters who were imagined as the waves of the sea. Each had a name describing a quality of water: the foaming wave, the rolling wave, the chilling wave, and so on. Together, they were the restless motion of the ocean itself. 9 sisters, forever rising and falling across the dark water. The fire giant Surtur stood at the edge of the world, in the burning land of Muspelheim, holding a flaming sword that shone brighter than the sun. He was a figure of immense and ancient power, older than the gods, and he was destined to play a great role at the very end, when he would ride out to set the world aflame. Until then, he waited at the southern edge of everything, keeping his fiery watch. There was a deep well of memory and wisdom associated with the being Mimir, who guarded the well beneath the world tree. In one tale, Mimir was beheaded in a conflict between the gods, and Odin preserved his head with herbs and magic so that it could still speak. Ever after, Odin was said to carry Mimir's head with him and to consult it for counsel, drawing on its ancient wisdom in difficult times. Wisdom, in fact, runs through the Norse myths like water through the roots of the tree. Odin's whole character was shaped by his ceaseless seeking of it, his sacrifice of his eye, his ordeal upon the tree, his journeys in disguise to question the wise. The Norse imagined knowledge as something costly, won through hardship and sacrifice, never given freely. Even the gods had to suffer for what they knew. poetry, too, was treasured. The gift of the mead of poetry was prized among gods and humankind alike, and skilled poets were deeply honored. The myths themselves were preserved largely through verse, through long poems memorized and passed down, and through the work of later writers who gathered the old stories together before they could be forgotten. The whole world we are wandering through tonight survives because people thought it worth remembering in careful, rhythmic words. Many of the gods had halls in Asgard, each with its own name and character. There was Gladsheim, the glad home, where Odin's high seat stood. There was Valaskjalf, roofed with silver, where Odin's watchtower Hlidskjalf was set, the high seat from which all the worlds could be seen. From there, a god could look out over everything that happened in the 9 realms. Among the lesser known gods were several quiet figures worth remembering. There was Ol, a god of archery, of skiing, and of the hunt, who lived in a place called Yggdrasil, the yew dales, for the yew was the wood of bows. He glided across the winter snow on long runners, a god of the cold, bright wilderness. There was Forseti, the son of Baldr, a god of justice and reconciliation, whose hall was called Glitnir, with pillars of gold and a roof of silver. And it was said that all who came to him with quarrels left reconciled, for he was the finest of all in settling disputes. There was Honir, a tall and quiet god who was given to the Vanir as a hostage when the 2 families made their truce, sent away with the wise Mimir to seal the peace. And there was Vali, a son of Odin, born for a single purpose, who in one telling grew to full strength in a single day for the one task of avenging Baldr. So even among the gods there were figures of stillness, of justice, of single, quiet purposes. Asgard was said to be encircled by a great wall, built to protect the gods from the giants. There is a story that a builder offered to raise this wall in a single season, asking for the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freyja as his payment, never expecting to succeed. With the help of his mighty stallion, he nearly finished in time, and the gods, alarmed, sent Loki to delay him, which is how Loki came to be the mother of Sleipnir. So even the wall of the gods carried a quiet tale of cleverness and consequence. The two families of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, had not always been at peace. Long ago, they were said to have fought a great war, the first war in the world. In the end, they made a truce and exchanged members as a sign of trust, which is how Njord, Freyja, and Freyja came to live among the Aesir in Asgard. The peace between them was sealed in one tale by all the gods spitting into a single vessel, and from that mingling the wisest of beings was made. The whole of the imagined cosmos then was a place of deep connection. The 9 realms were bound together by the branches and roots of one tree. The gods were related to the giants. Fate bound them all alike. The living and the dead were linked by roads that could be ridden. It was a world that felt woven, every part touching every other, like threads upon a loom. And over all of it hung a sense of time moving toward an ending. For the Norse did not imagine that their world would last forever. They believed it would one day come to a great and terrible close, a fated doom of the gods called Ragnarok. And then, after the ending, a new beginning. To this long, slow prophecy we now gently turn. The signs of Ragnarok would begin. The old poems say, with a great winter called Fimbulwinter, 3 winters would come one after another with no summer between them. Snow would drive in from all directions. The world would grow cold and dark, and the warmth and light of summer would not return. It is a quiet and dreadful image, a world slowly buried in endless snow. In that long darkness, the bonds that held the world together would begin to loosen. The wolf Fenrir, bound for so long beneath the earth, would at last break free of the ribbon Gleipnir, and the world serpent Jormungandr would stir in the deep and rise from the sea, thrashing the waters into great waves that flooded the land. The two wolves that forever chased the sun and the moon across the sky would finally catch them. One wolf would swallow the sun and the other the moon, and the sky would go dark. The stars would vanish from the heavens, and so the lights of the world, set in place at the very beginning from the sparks of the fire realm, would be put out at the end. 3 roosters would crow to mark the coming of the end. A golden-combed rooster named Gullinkombi would crow in Asgard to wake the warriors and the gods. Another rooster, red as soot, would crow down in the dim halls of hell, and a third would crow among the giants across all the realms at once, high and low. The birds would call out the dawn of the last day, and there would be no more sleeping. The earth itself would shake, mountains would crumble, and trees would be torn up by their roots. Every bond and fetter would snap, and in that loosening, the ship Naglfar would break free of its moorings. This was a ship made, in the old story, from the untrimmed nails of the dead, and it would be set afloat at last upon the flooding sea, carrying enemies of the gods toward the final field. From the burning south, the fire giant Surtur would ride forth at the head of the sons of Muspelheim, his flaming sword blazing brighter than the sun. As he crossed the rainbow bridge, Bifrost toward Asgard, the bridge would break beneath the weight of fire and fall. The shining road between the worlds would be lost. And now the watchman Heimdall would do at last what he had waited all the ages to do. He would lift the Gjala horn to his lips and sound a single mighty blast, ringing through all 9 realms, waking the gods and calling them to gather. Odin would ride to consult the head of Mimir one final time. Then the gods and the chosen warriors of Valhalla would arm themselves and march out to meet their fate upon a great plain called Vigrid. There the powers of the world would meet. Odin would face the wolf Fenrir, whose jaws, the poems say, would stretch so wide that they touched both the earth and the sky. And in that meeting, the All-Father would fall, swallowed by the great wolf, the seeker of all wisdom, undone at last by the doom he had long foreseen and could not escape. But Odin would be avenged at once. His son Vidar, the silent god, strong and grim, would stride forward. Vidar wore a special shoe, said to be made from all the leather scraps that cobblers had ever trimmed and cast aside through all the ages. With that shoe he would set his foot upon the wolf's lower jaw, and with his hands he would seize the upper jaw, and he would tear the great wolf apart, avenging his father. Thor and the world serpent Jormungandr would meet again, the 2 old foes who had once strained against each other across the dark water. This time there would be no cut line and no escape. Thor would strike the serpent down with his hammer and kill it at last. But the serpent's venom would already be upon him, and after walking 9 steps, Thor too would fall, slain by the poison of the beast he had finally overcome. Freyja would face the fire giant Surtur, but Freyja had long ago given away his magnificent sword for love of the giantess Gerd. Armed without it, he would fight bravely and fall, and his giving away of the sword would prove, at the very end, to be a quiet and costly thing. The watchman, Heimdall, and the trickster Loki, old adversaries, would meet upon the field and slay each other, and the one-handed Tyr would fall there too, fighting to the last. Then Surtur would fling his fire across all the world, Flame would sweep over the 9 realms, and the earth would sink beneath the sea. The world tree, Yggdrasil, would tremble and groan. The whole of the imagined cosmos, born so long ago from ice and fire, would end in fire and water, sinking down into darkness and silence. And yet, the old poems say, this was not truly the end. After the fire and the flood, the earth would rise again from the sea, green and new and fresh. Fields would grow grain that had never been sown. The waters would fall back, and a clean, quiet world would emerge from beneath the waves, washed and renewed. Some of the gods would survive. Vidar and another son of Odin named Vali would live on. Thor's sons, Modi and Magni, would inherit their father's hammer and carry it into the new world. And from the land of the dead, the bright god Baldr would return at last, along with his blind brother Hodor. The two of them reconciled. The gentlest of the gods, restored to a world without the old quarrels. In the renewed world, there would be a hall more beautiful than the sun, called Gimla, roofed with gold, standing in a high and peaceful place. There the good and the faithful would dwell in gladness, safe from all harm, for ages without end. After the long winter and the fire, the old poems imagine not only survival, but blessedness. A bright hall waiting on the far side of the ending. And the surviving gods would gather again upon the new green plain where Asgard once stood. There, in the grass, they would find the old golden game pieces that the gods had played with in the morning of the world, lying just where they had been left. The gods would sit together and remember the things that had passed. The great serpent, the mighty deeds, the ancient runes, talking quietly of all that had been, in the calm of a world made new. And humankind would not be wholly lost. Two people, a man named Lif and a woman named Lithrasia, whose names meant life, and one who strives for life, would survive the ending. They would shelter through the fire and the long winter within. The world tree itself, hidden in a wood, living on the morning dew. And when the new earth rose green from the sea, they would come out from their hiding place, and from them the world would be peopled once more. So the Norse imagined that even the end of the world was not final, but part of a great slow turning. Ice and fire at the beginning, ice and fire at the end, and then a new green earth rising quietly from the water with a new sun. For it was said that the swallowed sun would bear a daughter as bright as herself before the end, and that daughter would light the renewed world. The wheel would turn and begin again, and that is where we will let the old stories rest. Tonight, we have wandered through the empty void of the beginning, through the melting ice and the first giant, through the great tree and its 9 quiet realms, through Odin's ravens and Thor's thunder and Loki's strange children, through the Norns at their well and the death of gentle Baldr, through the long winter and the fire and the new green earth rising at the end, 100 small pieces of a vast imagined world gathered together in the dark. Now let the gods grow distant. Let Asgard fade. Let the rainbow bridge dim and the great hall quiet. Let the ravens settle. Let the wolves sleep. Let the world tree stand silent in the night, its branches still, its roots deep in the dark. The long winter softens. The snow keeps falling, slow and quiet, over the sleeping land. The fires of the south burn low and far away. The sea lies still beneath the vanished stars. A single light moves somewhere across the dark water. Moonlight on the waves, frost on the branches, mist drifting low over the cold ground. The tree stands. The well lies still. The threads rest upon the loom, unmoving now. Snow on the mountains, snow on the sea, snow over the long roads of the old north. Quieter now. The wind softens. The cold settles gently. Only the falling snow, only the still water, only the dark and the deep and the slow drift of sleep. Rest now, drift now into the long, quiet night.